Lando Norris takes pole at the Hungaroring by 12 thousandths of a second. Lewis Hamilton crosses the line at 1:17.219, close enough to taste his 10th career pole, only to watch it slip away in the final sector. And within the hour, the FIA stewards summon him anyway, this time for something that has nothing to do with lap time at all. So which story is really unfolding in Budapest this weekend? A raw speed battle decided by hundredths, or something underneath the surface? A Ferrari garage quietly pulling in two different directions at the exact moment it can least afford to. Because here is what makes this stranger than a simple near miss. 12 months ago, this exact intra-team equation ran the other way. In 2025, Charles Leclerc outscored his new teammate by a wide margin, 242 points to 156, and did it while out-qualifying him 21 times to 1. Hamilton, the most decorated one-lap driver in the sport's history, endured what by his own account was the hardest stretch of his career. Then 2026 arrived, the ground effect era ended, and the numbers flipped. Hamilton adapted to Ferrari's new car faster, built a real championship gap over his teammate, and looked, for the first time since his Mercedes years, entirely at home. Leclerc, by his own admission, spent the opening rounds trying to find a version of the car that suited him. So when the roles start reversing again, when Leclerc closes the points gap and Hamilton walks into a steward's room in Hungary, is that convergence a coincidence? Or is it the visible edge of something structural inside Maranello? Zoom in on the corner itself for a moment, because even the geography carries a strange kind of irony here. The bend where Oscar Piastri found a slow-moving Hamilton in his path is now officially named PK Corner, and the corner immediately after it, where Piastri showed his frustration on the approach, carries Hamilton's own name. A Ferrari driver momentarily blocking a rival at a bend named after another champion, right before reaching the bend named after himself, is the kind of detail that means nothing on paper and yet somehow colors the entire story anyway. Is that just a quirk of Hungaroring nomenclature? Or does it explain why this particular incident generated so much more attention than a typical backmarker moment would have? What makes the moment harder to file away as routine is Hamilton's own uncertainty about it afterward. In the cool-down room, he was, by his own description, still trying to work out in his head whether he had impeded anyone at all, a rare admission of genuine doubt from a 9-time pole winner at this circuit who has converted 6 of those poles into wins. Meanwhile, on the same timing sheet, Mercedes driver Andrea Kimi Antonelli was separately being investigated for a potential yellow flag violation tied to Max Verstappen's spin, meaning 2 separate stewards' inquiries were unfolding in parallel that afternoon. Does that dilute the significance of Hamilton's case, framing it as just one of several routine Saturday inquiries, or does it sharpen the spotlight further, given that only one of those 2 investigations ended up reshaping the entire second half of the grid? Not everyone watching this weekend agrees on what they are even watching. Even the broadcasters covering the session seem to split along similar lines within minutes of the checkered flag. Some coverage framed Hamilton's near miss purely as a gearing story, pointing straight to Norris's mechanical advantage through the final corner, and treating the steward's inquiry as an unrelated footnote. Other outlets led instead with the word bafflement, tying Hamilton's on-track uncertainty directly to his own comments about Ferrari's strategic call earlier in the session, as though the two were part of one continuous thread rather than 2 separate incidents. Neither framing is unreasonable, and neither claims to have spoken to anyone inside Ferrari's technical department directly. That split itself, playing out in real time across competing outlets before either driver had even reached the media pen, tells you something about how thin the line is here between an ordinary qualifying story and a much larger one. One reading, popular in the paddock chatter, is mundane, almost administrative, 2 unrelated storylines colliding on the same Saturday, a wind shift catching Leclerc out in final practice, and a straightforward racing incident catching Hamilton out in Q3. The other reading, whispered more than stated outright, is that Ferrari's technical department has been quietly managing two divergent setup philosophies for months, and that the tension of trying to serve both drivers is now surfacing in ways that go beyond car balance, bleeding into decision-making on strategy, and even into a driver's spatial awareness on track. Neither camp has anything close to proof. Both have circumstantial timing on their side, and that, more than any single incident, is what keeps this story alive. To understand any of it, you need the plain language version of what actually changed under the two cars this season. Since the Japanese Grand Prix, Hamilton has been running carbon industry brake discs, a supplier switch from Ferrari's traditional partner Brembo. In simple terms, different brake materials release heat differently and bite the rotor at a different rate, which changes how a driver feels the pedal into a corner, and by extension, how confidently they can trail brake right up to the limit. Leclerc stayed on the old system into the summer, then followed his teammate onto the same carbon industry discs around the Barcelona weekend. The same weekend, notably, in which he suffered a heavy qualifying crash. Was that switch cause, or coincidence? The record only tells us the two things happened close together, not that one produced the other. There is a second layer to the technical picture worth translating too. Because Ferrari's setup story did not begin this season, it began before a single 2026 lap was driven. Former driver Ralf Schumacher warned publicly, back when the new power unit regulations were still months from their debut, that Ferrari was essentially building two different cars at once, an aggressive A specification for early testing and a more developed B specification held back for competitive debut. Team principal Fred Vasseur confirmed as much himself, describing a deliberate two-phase approach to the new rules. In plain terms, that means the very foundation both Hamilton and Leclerc were asked to set up around was itself a moving target for months before Hungary ever entered the conversation. If the baseline car kept evolving underneath them, is it really so surprising that two drivers with different instincts ended up pulling that baseline in different directions once it stabilized? So follow the verified thread from there, because it does build into something. Leclerc has said publicly that he first tried to copy Hamilton's setup direction outright, only to discover it simply did not suit his driving style, and that his recent turnaround, capped by a British Grand Prix win that ended a wait of more than 600 days, came only once he abandoned that imitation and returned to his own approach. That is a driver, in his own words, describing a period of chasing his teammate's solution before rejecting it. Layer onto that Hamilton's own comments after Hungary qualifying, where he openly questioned Ferrari's call to send the cars out first for the final runs in Q3, saying he would not have chosen that order himself, and calling it, in his words, a shock. And layer onto that Leclerc's explanation for his own underwhelming final lap, that a wind change arrived and, in his words, he did not do a great job anticipating it with the car setup. Three separate admissions, from two different drivers, all pointing at the same fragile idea, that this Ferrari garage is negotiating conflicting technical instincts in real time, under a ticking clock, on a circuit where track temperature and wind direction can swing a lap by tenths. There is a statistical wrinkle that feeds this same idea from another angle. Earlier in the season, Hamilton reportedly held a commanding edge in the qualifying head-to-head, but by early June that gap had narrowed to just 5 poles to 4, a swing significant enough that Leclerc himself was asked to explain it publicly. His answer, on the record, credited Hamilton's growing familiarity with Ferrari's internal structure as much as raw pace, an explanation that frames the entire intra-team battle as something closer to an information asymmetry than a pure driving contest. If a large part of Hamilton's early advantage came from simply understanding Ferrari's processes faster, doesn't that suggest the team itself, not just the car, has been unevenly distributing its attention between two drivers who arrived from very different starting points? The pattern shows up again, away from qualifying entirely, in race strategy itself. At the Austrian Grand Prix, Hamilton openly disputed Ferrari's tire call, arguing that starting both cars on medium compound tires, rather than the harder option he preferred, left him with a strategy he considered suboptimal for that circuit. Ferrari's own explanation pointed to tire management concerns rather than any favoritism, but the underlying fact remains unusual on its own terms, that a driver of Hamilton's experience felt strongly enough about the call to say so publicly, mid-season, about his own team. Is a driver questioning strategy a sign of a garage failing to align two competing viewpoints, or is it simply the normal friction of any elite team managing an opinionated, seven-time champion alongside a homegrown prodigy who has raced for Ferrari his entire career? But the countercase deserves equal weight, because it is just as grounded in what actually happened on the timing screens. McLaren's advantage at the Hungaroring may have had nothing to do with Ferrari's internal politics at all. Post-session data appears to show Norris using notably shorter gearing than his rivals, allowing him to hold a higher gear through the final corner, where Hamilton was forced down an extra step, a mechanical detail entirely outside Ferrari's control. If the smallest margins came down to gear ratios rather than driver psychology, then the entire setup rift narrative may be reading intention into what was simply a track evolving faster than one car's balance could follow. And on the Hamilton investigation specifically, nothing in the Stewards' language points to team strategy at all. The document from the hearing describes a driver on a cool-down lap who, by his own account in the media pen, was not certain whether he had impeded anyone. A driver who asked in real time whether Piastri was even on a flying lap. That looks far more like a communication gap between one car and its own pit wall than any grand internal conflict about brakes or setup philosophy. Consider, too, how the radio transcript itself reads when you strip away the drama around it. Piastri's engineer had warned him of a yellow flag caused by Verstappen's spin in the same window that Hamilton was completing his lap, meaning two separate pieces of information were competing for attention in two different cockpits at once. Hamilton's own engineer told him only that Piastri was pushing, not that Piastri was already committed to a flying lap on the same piece of track. If the miscommunication traces back to a split-second gap in radio timing, rather than a driver distracted by broader team tension, then the entire premise of a setup rift explanation for the incident collapses under its own weight. Isn't the simpler explanation, in a sport where cars close at nearly 200 miles an hour and information arrives half a second late, usually the more likely one? There is also the matter of what both drivers have chosen not to say. Neither Hamilton nor Leclerc has used the word rivalry, tension, or conflict in any of their public comments this weekend. Leclerc's language has stayed clinical, describing a wind change and a setup he failed to anticipate. Hamilton's language has stayed procedural, describing his own uncertainty about the impeding call and his surprise at the team's session order. If there really were a brewing internal struggle serious enough to explain both a brake-driven form reversal and a Stewards' investigation in the same week, would two elite communicators, both deeply experienced in handling media scrutiny, really leave that much of the story to inference rather than address it directly, one way or the other? Widen the lens further, and this fits a pattern Ferrari has lived through before, though this specific version of it is new. Team principal Fred Vasseur has been candid that Ferrari deliberately pursued a two-phase development approach heading into these regulations, effectively running what he described as two different cars across a season, an aggressive gamble on the new power unit rules that meant sacrificing polish on the 2025 car in exchange for a head start into 2026. That is a team that has, by design, already been juggling divergent technical paths well before any driver rivalry entered the picture. Add to that the well-worn history of two elite teammates at the same Italian team, each convinced their own driving identity deserves priority, and Hungary begins to look less like an isolated flashpoint and more like the moment several slow-building pressures happen to land in the same 48 hours. Consider also how sharply the emotional terrain has shifted for each driver individually across just the last few months, because that context reshapes how any single Saturday should be read. Leclerc's low point arrived in Barcelona, the very weekend he adopted Hamilton's brake setup, when a qualifying crash dropped him to what he has since described as the bottom of his season. From there, an encouraging drive in Spain undone by a late mechanical failure, a near miss for pole in Austria, and finally a return to form at Silverstone and Spa, a recovery arc he has directly credited to abandoning imitation and trusting his own instincts again. Hamilton's arc runs almost in mirror image, a driver who by his own account rediscovered himself in Barcelona after the hardest season of his career, only to arrive in Hungary, now facing the opposite problem, a steward's summons rather than a setup crisis. When two teammates are moving through such different emotional cycles at the same time, on the same car, is it the setup sheets driving the story, or is it simply two athletes at different points in a very human process of adaptation, one that has nothing to do with sabotage at all? Consider the stakes in blunter terms too, because Formula One's Constructors' Championship runs alongside every individual title fight, and every grid position swapped between Ferrari and its rivals carries double weight. A grid penalty that lifts Piastri and Antonelli ahead of Hamilton does not just cost Ferrari points in the drivers' standings, it hands McLaren and Mercedes extra ground in the constructors' fight as well. A competition team principal, Fred Vasseur, has repeatedly said matters just as much to Maranello's ownership as any individual crown. If there is genuine friction over setup direction inside the garage, the constructors' table gives that friction a second, more institutional audience, one measured in prize money and factory prestige rather than personal glory alone. And the timing could not matter more, because the championship math is unusually tight right now. Entering Hungary, Hamilton held a lead over Leclerc, built through wins in Barcelona, with Leclerc's Silverstone victory cutting into that gap but not closing it, while Kimi Antonelli sat further ahead of both in the overall standings. A three-place grid penalty for impeding Piastri does not just cost Hamilton track position for one Sunday, it directly promotes Leclerc into second on the grid, ahead of his own teammate, at the exact circuit where their setup paths have visibly diverged. If there is any truth to a quiet Ferrari power struggle, this is the worst possible weekend for it to become public. A podium-adjacent grid slot suddenly redistributed by a steward's decision rather than a lap time, with both title rivals from the same garage, separated by fractions and by fresh grievance.